Hello and welcome to My Sex Bio. My name is Pierce Delahunt. I am your facilitator for the series Capitalism. Gonna do the usual disclaimers. I call myself a social emotional leftist. I'm an activist educator, been talking about this and doing this kind of work for a while. And also, I'm a very privileged person, and I do not profit off of the proceeds from attending my Sex Bios workshops, which I do encourage you to check out. Any proceeds that go to you pay from attending fucking capitalism goes to my Sex Bios other staff and their operation. Great. This month's theme of July, we're going to be talking about, the theme is sex addiction. We're going to take that to be addiction more broadly and political economy. And I hope you enjoy. If you haven't seen the political economy intro video, I encourage you to check that out. This is just up there as a reminder for that. But we're going to dive right into the theme. So I call this talk Bars of the Cage. And what do I mean by that? We'll get into. First, though, we're going to talk about something called the default mode network. Now, the default mode network is a network of parts of the brain that light up basically in unfocused rest is what it's kind of called. And we experience it as kind of our self-talk. It's the brain chatter when we don't have anything to do in that way. And the default mode network itself can be pleasant or unpleasant. It often gets talked about in kind of trauma spaces. And so in those contexts, the default mode network is seen as this like scary thing. But we can have a default mode network that we actually enjoy. And that's part of the work of healing from trauma. And so this is something that I want to use as kind of like the framework of where we're coming from when we're talking about addiction, because there's many ways to understand addiction. But one of those ways is that addiction is a hyper learning, a learning too much of whatever it is we're doing that reduces or shuts down the default mode network. And very importantly, that can be chemicals like alcohol and other drugs, or it can be things that we do. Because remember, the default mode network is active during unfocused tasks. So if we have a focused task to do, then that will also tamper down the default mode network. Studies have shown that video games are super effective at reducing the activity of the default mode network. A lot of people trying to quit cigarettes report that the activity of the cigarettes is still something that they're experiencing really strongly. And importantly, especially in the context of talking about sex addiction, there's a controversy around whether sex addiction counts as an addiction. And I think it's very clear that you can be addicted to all kinds of things. Gambling is an addiction. Why couldn't sex addiction be one? Social media is something that we can be addicted to. I think that there is a way that like reading tweets or Instagram posts or memes is actually more addictive, right, than reading a large book, because of that kind of focused task. Like you only have one little tweet to read, and then you can get hooked on that in a way that you wouldn't get hooked on reading a long book necessarily. It's still possible. Gabor Mate, a really wonderful person who studies all kinds of things around trauma and addiction and all kinds of things around this stuff. He himself reports about having been addicted to buying classical music on CDs, and he actually missed one of his, he's a doctor, he missed one of his patients' births, apparently, because he was so overcome with the urge, the compulsion to buy a CD that had classical music on. So that's a little bit of the frame that we can, in fact, be addicted to all kinds of things. So just to ground us in that. So this is the intrapersonal discussion around addiction. Just going to keep it really simple, not going to go into any more neuroscience than that. But that's the internal stuff. So now we're going to move into the interpersonal stuff, the stuff between people. And this I pull from a healthcare practitioner named Lisa Rankin. And she went through Western medical training and got tired of what she describes as the tell me your problem and I'll give you a pill culture of Western medicine. And then she got trained in Eastern medicine, and she got tired of what she calls, her words, the tell me your problem and I'll give you an herb culture of Eastern medicine. And so she ended up developing her own practice that when you go in, you fill out an entire lifestyle questionnaire talking about all kinds of things. Everything here you see on this, it's called the Whole Health Cairn. And the story she tells about doing this as a demonstrative example is that someone came in and was having trouble sleeping, and she said, "Can you give me something to help me sleep?" And Dr. Lisa Rankin, she looked through the questionnaire, and she said, "Listen, like, you're in an abusive relationship. You have precarious financial situation. You have no creative expression, and you are feeling purposeless. Like, there's not a lot I can give you for your sleep. Like, these are the things you need to address." And I think it's part of the culture that we've created that we are running away from our trauma and the things that like life is asking us to confront that actually lend itself to creating the conditions for increases in addiction. And as examples of that, now we're going to move into talking about the rat park experiments. And I want to be very clear here that I absolutely condemn these experiments. I think they're horrible and torturous, and they are established experiments and we can learn a lot from them. But this comes from a webcomic by that writer there, Stuart McMillan. The basic understanding of the rat park situation, the experiments, is that at one point, first, there were experiments done, I think in the 70s, that showed that rats in cages would rather have heroin or cocaine than water. And that was because, as we understood it at the time, that the chemicals themselves of heroin or cocaine were very addictive. And once you have some, your brain learns too much, that it needs more and more and more. And that happened with the rats in the experiment to the point that all of them became addicted and the majority of them OD'd to the point of death. And that was our standard model of understanding how chemicals and experiments work for a while. And then the rat park experiments came. And that's when some people took a look, researchers took a look at that experiment, and they said, well, wait a minute, these rats were alone by themselves, each in a different cage, in a situation that if we had done that to humans, we would call that solitary confinement and torture and a war crime. Not that that actually stops us from doing it to humans either, but they're in such a horrible situation that the only thing they are given that can be pleasurable is heroin. Of course they're going to fucking get addicted to heroin. And of course the majority of them are going to overdose to the point of death in that situation. So the researchers of the rat park experiments took the original experiments and made that new experiment basically the control group, but then they also had, in addition to that, you can kind of see a little schematic of it in this drawing here. They created an open area that was like a playpen where they had wood chips, shavings on the ground. They had exercise toys that they could run around on, those little wheels and stuff to have like physical engagement. They made it pretty, they painted it, and very, very importantly, they also had other rats to be in community with. And the researchers found that when they did this, not only did not a single rat ever overdose to the point of death on the cocaine or the heroin, but not a single rat even got addicted. They actually mostly didn't bother with it at all. They tried it, and the researchers made sure to get them to try it at least once, but it was there, so they gave it a shot. But then they saw what it did to them and that they couldn't be present in community with their rat people. And they said, no, thank you. And some of them actually took to it a little bit. They were engaging in what we might call recreational use of heroin, which is something that a lot of people actually believe is impossible in humans. And I understand that not every experiment on rats is something that we can directly translate to humans, but there are plethora of experiments and social and natural experiments that have happened that do demonstrate this. I'm just using the rat park experiments as an example because I think it's very illustrative. But to get to the point about being able to take heroin and actually not become addicted, there are a number of examples that Johann Hari refers to in his work. We're going to talk about him a little bit more later, so hold on that. But Johann Hari talks about Vietnam War veterans coming back from the war and having used heroin extensively there. And there was actually a lot of talk and a lot of fear around now all of a sudden we're going to see a huge spike in drug crime. And it didn't happen. We have people taking heroin for pain that they are prescribed. And yes, there is an opiates problem in the United States. And if the drugs worked the way that we understood just from the original rat park experiments, that it's just a chemical thing, if you take it, you get it hooked, we would have way more people hooked on the opiates than we currently do. So that's some example. But now, if you notice, we've started at the internal, we went into interpersonal, but now we're moving to the institutional stuff. So in the rat park experiments, the researchers actually play the role of the public policy people. The rats are still engaging in the interpersonal decisions, but the researchers themselves in the one community, they play a role of, we're going to invest in the social welfare and community of these rats. We're going to create the situations that facilitate rats to be in relationship with each other and to explore themselves much more than in this other situation. We're playing the role of, we're basically torturing these rats and making those institutional decisions. One, we know, reduces addiction basically down to zero. And the other one, we know, increases addiction basically to 100%. And that is going to bring us to the war on drugs, which this is another webcomic from the same writer, Stuart McMillan. And in this webcomic, he's talking about a letter that Milton Friedman wrote to Richard Nixon when Richard Nixon began pushing the war on drugs. And Milton Friedman explains, and I want to be clear here, I also condemn Milton Friedman, but there's a point that I'm going to be making with this. Milton Friedman is critiquing the way that Richard Nixon wants to go about this. And you can sometimes trust libertarians to criticize the government. They can at least do that much some of the time. Sometimes their critiques of the government even don't work out super well. But so Milton Friedman explains that a war on drugs, quote unquote, would actually create the conditions that would accelerate, that would increase addiction. And he explains why. And there's a fatal flaw that Milton Friedman makes in his opposition to Richard Nixon. And I'm going to talk about that toward the end. But that's a point that I want to drive home, is that the war on drugs actually creates the conditions for addiction. But moving on, we're going to talk about that and address that at the end. So that brings us to then, so you heard where the name of the talk comes from, Bars of the Cage. It comes from these experiments on these rats that are stuck in this cage. We're not in a cage, most of us, not some of us actually are, but at the same time, we're in a society created by public policy. So what are our cages? What are the bars of our cage? And I would argue that they are capitalism's alienations. And that brings us to Johann Hari's work. So this one book over here called Chasing the Scream, Johann Hari particularly looks at the relationship between capitalism and addiction and drugs. And there's a whole lot that we're going to talk about from there. And then in the other book, Lost Connections, Johann Hari goes through the relationship between capitalism and depression and anxiety. And I'm going to be kind of bringing the two together in this. But the point that Johann Hari makes in Lost Connections is that researchers have actually already identified 9 different parameters that predispose people or not to having anxiety and depression, 2 of which are the ones that we focus on so much in our mainstream discourse, which are genes and neurochemistry, how the drugs and chemicals play out in our brain. The other 7 are all social factors. And we're going to go through those here. I'm just going to name the conditions first on the part outside of the parentheses here. So we have meaningful work, being connected to meaningful work, how connected we are to meaningful work, how connected we are to other people, how connected we are to meaningful values, to childhood trauma, status and respect, the natural world, hopeful and secure future, and then finally, the genes and neurochemistry again. So those are the things that researchers have concluded predispose people to having depression or anxiety or not. How connected we are to those things. So then I'm going to talk about how capitalism alienates us from each one of those things at every level. And now we're getting into what's on the parentheses on the other side. So we'll start with meaningful work. This is just a straightforward Marxist concept of alienation, where if the purpose of our work or the effect of our work, if the effect of our work is that we show up for 8 hours a day and what did we do? We made our boss more wealthy. That's what we did, right? Then we are alienated from the value created by our labor, meaning that we are alienated from the meaning of our labor itself. So that is just a straightforward Marxist concept, alienation, and the worker exploitation under capitalism actually cuts us off from meaningful work. Other people, how does capitalism alienate us from that? One of the ways that we can understand capitalism, one of the phrases we can use to describe it is capitalism is the ruthless commodification of everything that exists. And that creates a transaction economy rather than what we used to live under long before was a gift economy where everything was relationally based, right? So under a transaction economy, any gift I can make to someone is actually a liability because now I'm giving away something for free. Whereas what I'm trying to do under capitalism is accumulate as much as possible. And so I never want to give anything away for free. I want more tit for tat. And then that dynamic encourages me to see other people as commodities that then I can extract value from in some way. So that's how capitalism alienates us from other people. Meaningful values. How does capitalism do that? So Johan Hari will talk about how we understand that eating junk food will give us junk health and will make us physically sick. And in the same way, having what Johan Hari refers to as junk values will make us spiritually sick. And capitalism pushes racism, sexism, ableism, ageism. It pushes us to be disconnected from our own selves and our own feelings so that we can go on with the labor that we need to perform in order to survive, so that we can't even address our healing. And so capitalism actually alienates us from meaningful values in order to go on existing so we can pay the rent. And it pushes us to internalize these horrible values of supremacy that we all have, that we have all internalized in some capacity, and that it takes a lifelong journey to uproot from ourselves. So that's how capitalism alienates us from meaningful values. Childhood trauma. I want to be clear here. Connecting to our childhood trauma doesn't mean that we want to fester in it or be traumatized, right? Connecting to our childhood trauma just means addressing it and confronting it and facing it and going through the process of that healing. Whereas capitalism encourages us to suppress that because healing is messy work, and healing and any messy work and healing especially gets in the way of our having to perform labor for people that want to exploit our labor. So it encourages also ageism, where we end up just further traumatizing our children because now we're suppressed and now we're pushing that on other people and we're telling them what they need to do and encouraging that. And there's a whole way that we can, that's a whole other presentation. Any one of these can be. But yeah, how capitalism pushes ageism and child abuse. Not to mention the disproportionate overrepresentation of children in our incarceration system, and including in solitary confinement, about how we're actually enacting torture on a lot of young people in the United States today. So then that's how capitalism alienates us from childhood trauma. We're disconnected from it, but we're still enacting childhood trauma everywhere. So alienating from status and respect. Now here, status and respect, we, in our lefty circles, can be kind of thought of in a negative light, but we all have these needs for status and respect. It's just that under a capitalist model, the way that we acquire status and respect is through a lot of violence. And that's through supremacy, through pushing other people down to raise ourselves up so that then we can claim that status and respect, rather than status and respect from living in integrity or adopting some other kinds of values that we have, or status and respect through service to others, for example. But capitalism alienates us from each other and alienates us from these meaningful values. So then the only ways that capitalism leaves for us to connect to status and respect is the way that it profits off of itself, which is through pushing other people down and through further exploitation. And the more that capitalism turns us all against each other, the more that capitalism can profit. Then the natural world. I think that that's probably a more obvious one, that capitalism has brought about climate catastrophe and the sixth mass extinction in planetary history. But 2 points there that maybe are lesser known is that the capitalism operates off of something called the enclosures. We all used to live in the commons, and I am fully aware that there's something called the tragedy of commons, and that is actually a myth. It's actually the tragedy of open access alongside privatization. What came out, the work that the tragedy of the commons came out of was just a thought experiment that was never actually studied. The commons is actually one of the most successful models of living that we have been able to experience. So the enclosures then are to privatize a commons and then to divvy it up and then rent it back out to the people who already were living with it and in communion and in relationship with those commons. And one way that is land. So the entire continent of Turtle Island that I happened to be on was stolen, is an enclosure and then rented out back to us, where everyone who was living on this land before the enclosures were enjoying it without having to pay rent to anyone. And then, of course, there's extraction, digging up for oil or whatever minerals there might be, and violently destroying the land in order to do that. So that's how capitalism alienates us from the natural world. And how does capitalism alienate us from a hopeful and secure future? Well, again, we have climate catastrophe. We're making our own society more fragile and creating the conditions that the environment that it rests on is more or less stable over time. So we don't have the hopeful or secure future in that way. Plus the stratification of people, such that if we're living under a stratification of people where we have the supremacy and the internalized isms and all that, then where we are in that placement no longer is a place of security, a source of security or hope. Because how are we going to get out of that except by enacting more violence onto people? So that's how capitalism alienates us from hope, a hopeful and secure future. And then finally, even the genes in the brain changes, the neurochemistry and stuff, even that, I'm going to argue that capitalism creates the conditions for anxiety and depression and addiction at the level of genes and brain changes, because all of the trauma that I've named here lives on. They've done those studies that through epigenetics, we pass down our trauma even intergenerationally. And that's been shown especially with Holocaust survivors as well as Native genocide survivors, that their grandchildren and great-grandchildren still exhibit the trauma through the epigenetics. So even at that level, we are predisposed to anxiety and depression. And of course, that is going to predispose us to drug use or addiction more broadly, however it is that we use, or whatever it is that we do or use to tamper down that default mode network, so that we can quiet down all of that trauma that expresses itself in the default mode network. And that finally brings me to that point about the fatal flaw that Milton Friedman was making in his opposition to Richard Nixon about the war on drugs, is that the war on drugs was never about reducing addiction in the first place. And to help illustrate that point, I want to share the story of Harry Anslinger, Judy Garland, and Billie Holiday, which Johann Hari will talk about in his books and presentations, and also another resource I have in the list will also talk about. But Harry Anslinger was the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, and was therefore in charge of and hugely influential in setting up the United States drug policy for all time after him. And there were two people, prominent people, who were struggling with heroin that are relevant to this story. One was Billie Holiday, who was very famously singing the song Strange Fruit, which the song title, Strange Fruit, is a metaphor for the Black people hanging from the trees who have been lynched. And the song itself was very powerful, the performance of which was said to be very powerful. I wish I could have seen it. And Billie Holiday famously vomited at every instance that she was performing it. But that song really was impactful on the audience that she was performing it to. And of course, that song was a critique to the United States system, and how, given how impactful it was a threat. Whereas Judy Garland was like America's sweetheart. No shade to Judy Garland for being America's sweetheart, but she just was not a threat to the capitalist system. And Harry Anslinger and the law enforcement broadly hammered down Billie Holiday to the point that she was in the hospital handcuffed, and the authorities refused to allow her to have methadone, and they killed her because of that. In doing that, they killed her. Whereas Judy Garland, when she was going through her heroin crisis, Harry Anslinger actually personally said, take a vacation, get some rest, take all the time you need to kind of get yourself kind of resourced, basically. And of course, this demonstrates that Harry Anslinger and our system knows what to do about people who have addiction and how we can support them. But of course, that was never the point, because Harry Anslinger wasn't interested in trying to help Billie Holiday recover from addiction. Harry Anslinger was trying to stop Billie Holiday from threatening the system of power that he was invested in. And it is precisely that is the purpose of the war on drugs. It was never about getting people to stop taking drugs. That was never the point. Richard Nixon enacted the war on drugs, pushed the war on drugs to disrupt his political enemies. And I'm going to be reading from a quotation, and I'm gonna pull that up right now. So this quotation comes from Nixon's domestic policy chief. His name is John Ehrlichman, and he told this to a writer for Harper in an interview. The writer's name is Dan Bowham, and you'll have all this information in the slides if you like. But this is the quotation. In his words, he says, "The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." And those are the words from John Ehrlichman, Nixon's domestic policy chief. And this is important for the reason that Nixon was not trying to reduce addiction. So no amount of arguing about what would reduce addiction was going to change Nixon's mind. The whole point was that it helped Nixon preserve power by disrupting communities and political enemies. And that actually created the conditions for increased addiction. And capitalism, anytime the system sees a way that it can enhance power for itself, will run away with it. The war on drugs actually further profits capitalism, because now that we have oppressed communities who are we've raised their addiction rates as well, and we've incarcerated them, that is the beginning of mass incarceration in the United States, where now we have all this free labor in prisons, and now we can just use them to do what we want. And every prison built in the United States is a factory where workers' rights do not exist. And I want to be clear, people are doing that work of prisoner organizing and pushing back on that. But that is how the system of capitalism sees this, and why capitalism determines what is allowed to move forward and grow, and what is violently oppressed and pushed down. And that is why we have these increased addiction rates, because it profits capitalism to do so. And you'll notice, of course, that some substances and behaviors that we might call compulsive are violently oppressed and tamped down, and other substances and behaviors that we might call compulsive are actually encouraged. like workaholism. There's a whole hustle and grind culture that is allowed to exist. Coffee, right? The fact that people have that addiction but it is one that benefits capitalism. And so some are criminalized and some are not, but at an institutional society level, all of this profits capitalism and allows it to keep going. And capitalism allows those to keep going. Cool. So that is the bulk of the presentation. I'm going to leave you here with some reflection questions. If you were in the live workshop with us, you'd be talking about these reflection questions in small groups, in breakout and Zoom. But here I just leave them for you to reflect on. This here is the tree of contemplative practices. I just offer this because you don't have to think about these questions just sitting still like a Zen meditation practitioner. You can also do it in an artistic reflection, or in community, or in movement mindfulness, like walking around or stretching, whatever. So I leave that there for you to reflect on, however is your best way. But the reflection question I offer to you, there are two. One is, what compulsions might I experience that help me de-stress in the short term, but create stress in the long term? Right? So maybe you don't have something that could be clinically called an addiction, but I think we all experience compulsions. We all experience something that helps us reduce the default mode network that then we're more likely to use in maybe a way that we could call problematic. Maybe not every time we do that, it's problematic, but I leave that there as a question for you. I'll talk about that a little after. And then the next question I have for you is, what reconnections or investments in my whole health can I make to reduce the compulsive force? If you remember, right, there's the 9 different things that Johan Hari leaves us, and there's the whole health Cairn that Lisa Rankin gives us. How can we invest in those things? How can we make those reconnections into those things so that we actually create a default mode network that we are more comfortable being in, and that we're not trying to run away from? And the thing I want to say, I actually just presented this talk to the sober faction of the Satanic Temple, and I got a question I hadn't thought of in a while, which was, what do I think of the disease model of addiction? And so I had some thoughts on it, and I want to share that here too, is that firstly, the disease model is an improvement on the moral model of addiction, that personal failure as an individual if you become addicted to something that is disgusting and fucked up and wrong. And I think that there are some shortcomings of the disease model in that it strikes me as very binary, where some people are addicts and they have this disease called addiction, and some people don't have this disease called addiction and they're not addicts. And that means if I happen to not have an addiction and I happen to not be an addict, then that means I'm fine, right? I'm healthy. Whereas I would actually argue we all experience these compulsions, and we all experience trauma, and we're all sometimes trying to run from trauma and sometimes addressing our trauma. And I think if we more frame things that way, then we can be more honest about what institutionally works and what doesn't, as well as more honest with ourselves about what are we running from and what can we do about it. So I offer that. Cool. Thank you for that. And I also leave you with this quotation on the reflection questions. I always like to end with this. Radical educator John Dewey says, we don't just learn from experiences, we learn from reflecting on the experience. And I would argue we need to do that reflection in conversation, in community with others. So I encourage y'all to have these conversations with other people. Thank you so much for joining this. I'm just going to do now the resources walkthrough so that y'all can see where you might continue learning about this. The stuff in the lower left there is stuff more specific to political economy in general, or me and my sex bio specifically. So please do check those things out there. And then the stuff on the right here, Stuart McMillan does those web comics that I took little screenshots of. Rat Park is an excellent documentary that's hard to see right now. It's only available on a Canadian streaming platform, but I leave you with the trailer and some behind the scenes footage that get into those conversations. Lisa Rankin has the presentation and an article about her approach to whole health. Do check those out. And then we also have a lot of stuff from Johan Hari. He's done a lot of interviews and presentations about this. He's got the 2 books, Chasing the Scream and Lost Connections, and either one of which he's done a lot of presentations and interviews on. So check those out for sure. The upper part is the part where he's talking about addiction, and then starting at depression and anxiety, he's talking about those. And then I leave you here with, you have Dr. Carl Hart, who does really awesome work. He's a neuroscientist who is also a drug rights and reform advocate. So really awesome stuff there. As well as Gabor Mate. I've referenced his compulsion to buy classical music CDs before. He's got really powerful stuff. And then in that other section, that first article there, Meth Problems Fester Without Housing First, is actually written by someone who has addiction to meth. And I would definitely encourage reading that. It's got some personal experience in there, as well as institutional arguments about policy changes. And then that one comic book, Cannabis, is the history of the criminalization of cannabis, which is an excellent look at that. And then, 2 papers there on the different models of alcohol and drug use and the concept of addiction and those models. That gets into like the moral model versus the disease model and some other things, some other kinds of stuff there. So I thank you so much for attending and watching. Check us out at My Sex Bio. Look at their other stuff. They do great work. Check out my other videos if you like. Whatever it is you want to share with people is great. Thank you. Deep gratitude, and I will see you all at the next one. Cheers.